all of the viewports, top, side, front, are linked together in their position, centering on the same exact point. If you go up to File and Options, we can choose to check on, under Display Options, independent zooming and panning of views. This will allow you to work independently of each of the viewports, so you can move around in just one view and not have it all moving together or constrained to the same area. So this can be really helpful if you don't want everything to automatically always be focusing on the same point of focus throughout all the viewports. So that's pretty helpful. It also allows you to set up independent views of the same viewport, so we could have more than one top viewport, each focusing on a different area of the scene. So it really depends on how you want to work, but those options are available if you wish to use them. Another option is the fixed camera and light sizes in view, and each of the views. This will keep the camera the same size no matter how much we're zooming out or zooming into the scene. Right now I turned it off, so we're seeing that we can zoom in and out. The camera size decreases. Turning this option on, they're always going to remain the same size. I also want to note that the sun and pretty much all directional lights, which is a sunlight, will always move with the camera. Now, there is an option whether or not you want the sun or directional lights to point at the camera, but the actual movement of the camera itself is always linked to the sun. So we can see that sunlight will move with the camera, and even though its position itself is not changing, it constantly moves. So that does make it a little difficult if you're setting up a graph or any sort of manipulation, and it's definitely something to keep in mind. Another thing I want to mention is the sensitivity of the controls in the main camera view here, and where we have a little main camera preview and the camera control center. If you're moving into a scene and you find that it's too quick, it's too fast, all of these controls for changing the camera's focal, moving back and forth, and also panning the view and rotating can all be slowed down by holding down the control key. So if I want to move in and out very slowly, I can just hold down control as opposed to it going very quick. This makes it easier if you have a smaller scene. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new scene. So if you're working on small plants or different objects and you want to move around the scene, you can see it goes very quickly around, sometimes really hard to center on something. So if you hold down control, you can slow down the movement. It makes it a little easier to work with it. And I want to make a few notes about cameras. Go ahead and just load in infinite procedural terrain. What we can do is use this little save icon to store the camera and create additional cameras. We can then switch between them and they become active. Now to edit these cameras, let's say you want to delete one or switch between it different ways, we can edit the object, which is going to open the advanced camera options. This gives us access to pixel aspect, focal length, the horizontal field of view, vertical field of view. There's also a lens aberration, which will create the illusion of a sort of a fisheye look, or whether or not you want it to be a convex or concave lens. So you can set those options that way. You can also turn on the panoramic and spherical render. If we go to the camera manager, we can now delete cameras. And I also want to note that if you are an xStream user and you're using the integrated version, and you move over to the standalone, if you have cameras in your view scene, the active camera is the one that is going to carry over into your host application. So you may have to switch to the standalone version, move to a different camera, and then reload the scene from file in order to get another camera in the scene. You can then normally duplicate that camera as a host application camera and kind of load the scene back and forth to get any cameras over. There are other post-processing effects, lens glare. Lens glare can be helpful for removing some of the graininess of clouds, but you wouldn't want to use this for animation. And if lens glare is set too high in some of your scenes, it can cause it to flicker or produce a very interesting grain if the amount is set too high with certain types of anti-aliasing. We also have the option to set a backdrop image. So instead of just using the environment mapping, we can load in an image to use as the back if you're going to be setting up compositing plates. And I do want to make a quick note about the advanced camera options. And that's basically a lot of these post-process effects are not a good idea to use when you're saving HDRI images. They are more of an 8-bit image process. Exposure is an HDRI control. Natural film response is not. That is 8 or 16-bit. And a lot of these settings you wouldn't want to use if you're saving out EXRs or HDRI or any of the other 32-bit formats. I also want to show that there is a render area option available. Right next to the camera, you can choose to select a render area. So that way, instead of rendering an entire scene, if you just want to focus on one specific area, you can draw out the render rectangle to render just in that zone. That'll work with any preview mode you're working on. If you're rendering to the main view, it's going to depend on the settings in the camera manager or the camera render options. If you're rendering it to screen, this render area will pop up. So now if I rendering to screen, it's going to have a separate window rather than rendering in the view. As you can see that pop up, and then it'll start to render. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another option is if you want to remove it, you can discard the render area by right-clicking or select a new render area, and then it'll immediately start to render. I do want to note that if you select the use render area and you don't draw out a rectangle right away, the next time you click in the viewport, it will attempt to render the scene. And if you take a look also in the render options, you can see the render area coordinates, the size, pixel resolution, and then the position on the actual picture itself. So we could just discard that. If you select the camera and take a look, there are additional options. The lock height I didn't really describe too much. Basically, it keeps the camera above the terrain or whatever object is underneath it. You can lock the height so that it'll never go underneath. Keep camera level. There is the backdrop you can access directly through here. You can set up targeting for the camera. You can also access the camera manager by selecting the camera and clicking on this little camera icon. So it doesn't have to be directly through the advanced camera options. You can also set up a blur and focal distance if you want to create a depth of field effect. That does require much higher render settings, and it's usually much easier just to export the Z-depth image and take care of that in post. When you're setting up the focus distance, it does show within the viewport. Go ahead and see if we can find this camera. And we should be able to see a dot showing the focal distance. At the moment, it does not look like it is showing. Normally, you'd be able to see a small projected dot from the camera itself showing the focal length or the focus distance. I want to make a note about focal length. We can see right now it's described or shown as millimeters. That is going to be something that's completely separate from the internal unit of the scene. It's always going to show as millimeter unless you go to File and Options, Display Options, and you want to show field of view as the focal. So now it's 55.6 degrees. So if you want to work with field of view rather than focal length, you can set that option. I also want to make a note that if you're controlling the focal length with a graph, which is the number output in the object graph, let's type in a value of 65. So any number that's entered will need to be divided by 2, which we can set up a couple of different ways. I like to use a blender with divide, setting up a constant node, constant number of 2. So then we're dividing input 0, which is the first connection. If you highlight over, we can see input 0. Input 1 is going to be the second connection to this divide. You can also connect other nodes to this, but what we can see is now it's divided by 2, so the number we enter here, 65, is also that focal length being described. So type in 35 millimeters, see that show up correctly. So this number does have to be divided by 2. And if you want to create a meta node for this, you can highlight all 3 of these, click Create Meta Node. We're going to edit, and now this number we can publish, and let's call this focal length. And we could set up a group as well. We'll just call this group camera. Click OK. And now in the meta node, we can see the focal length, and the output is to the focal. So if we save this out, and I'm going to call this focal, copy the file name over to the title, a description will show up in the second bar. And now anytime you want to control that focal, all you need to do, load a meta node, select that focal, connect the focal output to it, and then you don't have to set up that division. And it's set up every single time, you don't need to worry about it. So that's a quick and easy meta node you can create to control the camera focal. That's really the only number that works like that needs to be divided. Pretty much everything else is straightforward. I just want to do a quick run through of the gbuffer and multipass. I'm not going to go real in depth with it. The gbuffer and multipass becomes available with any mode other than the preview mode. This has to do with the optimize last render pass option being checked as part of the preview mode. It is not part of Final, Broadcast, Superior, Ultra, or the user settings unless checked. So just with the Final, we can take a look. We can enable the gbuffer or the multipass. There is a difference between the two. If you're using a compositing application that accepts the 2 formats that are outputted by the gbuffer, which are RLA and RPF formats. So if you have a compositing application that supports these, you can output the gbuffer. If not, you can use the multipass. And for the most part, pretty much all of the components that are available in the gbuffer are available in the multipass, except the gbuffer is combined into a specific type of file handled by compositing applications. Plus, the one output that is not available within the multipass is the velocity output, which can be very important for using a post-motion blur on a scene, an animation. You can, of course, get away with it using the Z-depth output, which is, of course, available within the multipass. Multipass works in a couple of different ways. We can save out individual separate files that we can set the file type, all of course being the same file type, or we can save a multi-layered Photoshop file. So this will set up channels and layers. So depending on how many components we have selected, you will see how many layers and how many channels, depending on different masks. Basically, the masks will be more carried over to the different channels. So now we can see we have 13 layers and 6 channels. I also want to note there is a cloud mask option. This cloud mask is all cloud layers. So if you do need a more specific mask, you will need to turn off individual cloud layers. I also want to note that the z-depth pass does not include clouds. I have created training to show how you can create z-depth pass for clouds very quickly, and also define your own mask. So if you want to check out any other training, those options are available, and this coverage a lot more in depth. Even though there is a z-depth pass within the multipass buffer, anytime we save the initial scene, so if we were to save render to disk, the options, we are automatically given the option to save color, alpha, and depth maps, so the z-depth. So this way you have a separate alpha and a separate z-depth, so you could set a different format if you wanted to run the multipass as one format and then still have maybe an HDRI image. I typically use EXR 32-bit format for all of z-depth outputted from view because it tends to work the best. PNG files I usually use for an alpha, if not a TIFF file. If your scene is enabled for animation, then the animation render options become available. If not, they are grayed out. So what we need to do is first create an animation where I'll just add a keyframe to the camera on its position just to create and let view know we have an animation. If we open the animation render options, we can then set the frame rate of the scene. And I do want to note that this is a non-destructive frame rate. So keyframes are based on seconds. And when you want to change the frame rate, it will not change the time. So it'll just add more frames in between each keyframe, which is pretty nice. A couple of advanced animation options, some distant blurring, an intensity of max radius, multi-frame anti-aliasing, deterministic anti-aliasing. These are for anti-flickering. So there's quite a few options you can explore within there. And then the render quality can be defined with a preset. If we edit, we can get the main render options opened, and this really just controls the primary output. If you want to save as individual files or save as an animation format, best to really save image sequences, worry about compression later. So quite a bit to go through there. If you, anywhere within the program, select the question mark, it will take you to the PDF help document specific to the panel or the area of the application you've selected this button in. So if you need any more in-depth information about a certain area of the program, a little more technical description, need to access the manual, it is a very quick way to get to that section without having to search through the document. So that is pretty nice. And one last note about cameras. When you use the merge scene option, cameras and lights are typically carried over as well. So atmospheric settings may also get changed depending on that sunlight if it's getting merged in. So I just thought I'd mention that fact. And that's pretty much all I'm going to cover for the different camera options. You can switch between cameras if you take a look at the aspect by actually selecting the camera. But I'm not going to go too much more in depth with this. Although I will note that now, looking in the viewports, you can see that focus distance showing up on one of the cameras. So that's what it will look like when you're editing that amount once it's selected and active. And we can see that changing. We can also adjust the exposure, and sometimes it'll transfer all of the information over to all the cameras. Otherwise, you can independently go through and select some of these options. As you can see, the exposure did change from camera to camera, but it can be touchy, just to let you know sometimes that it is. I'm just going to make one last quick note, and that is, if you've created a render within the viewport, or even rendering to screen, at any time you can show that last render in the back, which would be behind all the objects, which allows you to create a little bit of a better comparison if needed. best thing to do would be switch over to a wireframe view so you can view behind the objects, and that can be pretty useful.